Welcome back to VATSIM 101, everybody, where we're going to be talking about how to fly instrument approach procedures. These are relatively complex procedures that are going to help us get down into an airport when the visibility is very low. We're going to talk about how to read the charts, what an approach is, and what expectations we're going to have for the type of approach that we're going to be flying. So what exactly is an instrument approach? Instrument approaches are predetermined flight paths for IFR flights landing in an airport where the visibility is very low. These procedures are how pilots are able to get down to the airport and at times may not see the runway until the very last second. Approaches are broken down into three different categories. We have precision approaches, approaches with vertical guidance, and non-precision approaches. Of those three categories, there are a ton of different types of approaches that we could fly. Today, we're going to focus on the ones that you are most likely going to see on the VATSIM network. That's going to be the ILS approach, which is the instrument landing system, localizer approaches, RNP or required navigation performance, otherwise known as RNAV approaches, VOR approaches, charted visual flight procedures, and visual approaches. So let's talk about the differences between precision and non-precision approaches, because whether an approach is a precision approach or a non-precision approach is going to affect how we are going to fly this approach and what's going to be expected of us. So precision approaches provide lateral and vertical guidance, meaning that it is both going to keep you aligned with the runway's extended center line, and it is also going to give you a flight path down towards the runway. Precision approaches will utilize equipment that is on the ground at the airport. For the minimum criteria, they use decision altitudes, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in the video. These are going to be your ILS and GLS approaches. Now, non-precision approaches are going to be very, very different. So your non-precision approaches are going to provide lateral guidance, and they may provide vertical guidance depending on the type of approach that you're flying. But that vertical guidance is not going to be as precise as the precision approaches. For the minimum criteria, they are going to use minimum descent altitudes. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the video. Most of your non-precision approaches are not going to utilize any equipment on the airport itself. These are going to be your RNAV approaches or RNP approaches, VOR approaches, and NDB approaches. NDB approaches you don't really see too much in the VATSIM network, so I really wouldn't worry too much about them. NDB approaches suck anyway, but just wanted to list it there in case you do run across one. Now let's break down the different types of approaches that we could be expected to fly on the VATSIM network. The first one, and the most common type of approach you're going to see, is the ILS approach. This only utilizes airport ground equipment for lateral and vertical guidance. They will use a localizer, which is a sensor at the very far end of the runway to keep you aligned laterally, and a glide slope off to the side of the runway that's going to give you vertical guidance. Next, we have the ground-based augmentation system, which is the GLS approaches. The difference between a GLS approach and an ILS approach, it uses satellite data for your lateral guidance and ground equipment for your vertical guidance. Next, we have area navigation or required navigation performance, RNAV or RNP approaches. These only use satellite technology for lateral guidance. Some of them do provide vertical guidance, but again, they're not going to be as precise as ILS or GLS equipment that is physically located at the airport. The easiest way to explain RNAV and RNP approaches is they use GPS technology for their approaches. We have VOR approaches, which VOR standing for very high frequency omnidirectional range. I'll let you marinate on that one for a minute. These approaches are going to use VOR radials to get you to the runway. Now, depending on where the VOR is located in relation to the airport, it could be an offset approach, meaning that you are not going to be perfectly aligned with the runway to come in and land. The last type of approach, which I personally hate the absolute most, are the NDB approaches, which are non-directional beacons. And they'll be flown in the same way where you're going to be tracking a certain bearing away from that NDB, but they are a little bit more tricky than VOR approaches. Very, very rarely are you ever going to fly an NDB approach, both in VATSIM and really in the real world. Now, off here on the right-hand side are images of what the equipment on board the plane is going to look like. So the top image is from an Airbus A320, which is mostly what your glass cockpit planes are going to look like. And the bottom is a VOR receiver that you're going to find in some of your older planes that don't have glass cockpit technology. So looking at the one for the Airbus A320, at the very bottom of the attitude indicator, you're going to see a pink diamond that is perfectly centered with that yellow bar. And then off to the right where the altimeter is, you're also going to see another diamond with a bar perfectly aligned with it. So those diamonds are going to be the localizer and the glide slope. The one on the bottom is going to be the localizer. The one on the right-hand side is your glide slope. When they are perfectly centered as they are, that means you are both on the localizer and the glide slope. If the diamond is above that bar, it means you're going to be below the glide slope. slope, and if the diamond is below that bar, it means you're above the glide slope. For the localizer, if the diamond is to the left of the bar, that means you're going to be to the right of the localizer. If the diamond is to the right of that bar, it means you're going to be to the left of the localizer. And then on the bottom, it works the exact same way. The vertical bar is your localizer, and the horizontal bar is your glide slope. Next, we have our charted visual flight procedures and our visual approaches. These are not considered instrument approaches. They are going to be approaches you're going to fly using visual cues or vectors from air traffic control to get you to the airport. Charted visual flight procedures are going to have specific charts you're going to look at in order to ensure you're flying the approach correctly. They're going to use landmarks like bridges, fuel tanks, buildings, water towers, shopping malls to keep you oriented on the approach. Two very good examples of charted visual approaches that I personally love to fly are the River Visual 19 flying into Ronald Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C., and the Husky Visual 16 flying into Seattle. In order to fly these approaches, you will need some sort of VFR conditions that will be specified in the charts themselves. Most of these are also going to be backed up by actual instrument approaches. For example, the River Visual 19 is backed up by the RNAV 19 approach. So a lot of the fixes that are on the RNAV 19 for DCA are going to be in the area of where some of those landmarks are. Visual approaches are vectored approaches by ATC, meaning that the controllers are going to give you certain headings to fly until you're able to see the airport, and then they're going to clear you for the visual approach. So you will either need to see the airport you're going to be landing at or an airplane in front of you that you are going to follow. Once you are cleared for a visual approach, you can start to descend at your discretion to come in and land. And just like the charted visual flight approaches, you want to back that up with some kind of instrument approach just to keep yourself oriented. My personal preference is if there is an ILS approach that I can use as a backup redundancy, that's what I'm going to use. Sometimes there's not an ILS that's available for that runway, in which case I'll use an RNAV approach, but have some sort of backup approach loaded into your plane. That way, if you get a little disoriented, you'll be able to keep yourself on track. Instrument approaches are made up of 5 different segments. We have our transitions, our initial approach, the intermediate approach, the final approach, and the missed approach. So transitions are feeders from the en route phase of flight. These are going to start at initial approach fixes designated on the approach plate itself. The initial approach segment is going to start to align you with either the intermediate approach fix or the final approach fix. There may be some speed and altitude restrictions that you'll have to maintain during the initial approach segment, so just make sure that you are carefully reviewing those charts. They may also include a procedure turn or a hold in lieu of a procedure turn, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a couple of minutes. The intermediate approach is going to align you with the final approach fix. Intermediate approaches are often going to have a higher crossing altitude than your final approach, so it's not uncommon to see a step down in altitude from the intermediate approach fix to your final approach fix. Intermediate approach fixes can also be shared with the initial approach fixes. Really just depends on the type of approach that you're flying. So there may be times where you don't see an intermediate fix, so don't let that scare you. If you only see the initial fix and the final fix, it's because the intermediate and the initial fix are the same. The final approach is when you begin your final descent down to the runway, and that is going to be identified by the final approach fix. And once you start your descent, you're going to take that all the way down to your minimum altitude before you have to make a decision whether or not you're going to land. The missed approach is a charted route that you are going to fly in the event you get down to your minimums and you cannot see the runway. The route that you're going to fly is going to take you out to a missed approach fix where there will be a designated holding pattern for you to fly until provided instructions by air traffic control. Some approaches may have multiple missed approach fixes. It's mostly going to be at your larger airports where there's a lot of planes that could be flying in there. There will be a primary missed approach fix, and any secondary missed approach fixes will be specifically labeled on that chart. Every instrument approach that you are going to fly will have a set of minimum criteria that you will need to adhere to. So in order for you to proceed with your landing, you will either need to have the runway or the runway environment in sight. Precision approaches will have a decision altitude and a decision height. So the decision altitude is your altitude above sea level. Your decision height is your height above the ground. And both of those will be listed side by side. Your decision on whether you're going to execute the missed approach is going to happen at the decision altitude or the decision height. So when you descend down to your decision altitude, you don't see the runway or the runway environment. At that point, you're expected to fly the published missed approach. Non-precision approaches will have minimum descent altitudes or minimum descent heights. Just like the decision altitude and decision height, the MDA is the height above sea level, the MDH is the height above ground level. The decision on when you're going to execute the published missed approach is going to be when you get to your minimum descent altitude and when a certain amount of time has elapsed or when you're a certain distance from the airport. Because you're not getting precise vertical guidance, you may actually get down to your minimum descent altitude faster than you're really supposed to. If you get down to your minimum descent altitude early, you can hold that altitude until you either get to the distance you're supposed to be at or until you get the amount of time that is supposed to elapse before you're required to execute the missed approach. Approaches will also have a certain visibility requirement in order for you to even shoot the approach, and that's going to be in your weather report. So if the reported visibility is less than the visibility requirement of that approach, you will not be permitted to fly that approach. The same thing applies with another set of criteria called the runway visual range. Runway visual range, or RVR, is measured by sensors that are along the side of the runway. If the runway visual range is reported lower than what the approach says it needs to be, you will not be permitted to fly that approach. You will need to wait for conditions to improve. The approaches are also going to have different aircraft categories, and the categories are based on what your ground speed is for that approach. Make sure when you're looking at your minimums that you're looking at the correct category of aircraft. As we talked about before, in order for you to descend below minimums and proceed with landing, there are certain things that you're going to need to be able to see in order to continue. Most of the time, you're going to see the runway clear as day and you're going to be able to come in and land. But if the visibility is very, very low, there are certain lights and markings on the runway that are going to help you descend below the minimum criteria. So you are permitted to descend 100 feet above the touchdown zone elevation when you can see the white approach lights with no other visual references. You can then continue with the landing if you can see the following visual cues on the runway. So you have the red terminating or side row bars on the approach lighting system, the runway threshold or the threshold lights, the runway end identifier lights, which not to be confused with the runway end lights. The runway end identifier lights are blinking lights on the sides of the runway threshold. If you can see the visual approach slope indicator, either if it's a VASI or a PAPI, the touchdown zone or the touchdown zone lights, or the runway itself or any of the runway markings. Now over here on this graphic I provided, these are going to show you the different types of lights that you could potentially see. So you can pause to take a look at these. On this particular runway, there aren't any runway end identifier lights. Those would be located right next to the threshold lights, and they'll be bright blinking white lights. And the red terminating side row bars are part of the approach lighting system you can see right before the runway. Now let's take a look at some approach charts. This one is going to be the ILS runway 17 approach in the Asheville Regional Airport in North Carolina. So before we start reading through any of these charts, we want to make sure that we're looking at the right airport and we're looking at the right approach. On the upper left-hand side, we can see KAVL, which is Asheville Regional Airport, and on the upper right-hand side, it's in Asheville, North Carolina, and it's the ILS or localizer runway 17. Now, the reason it says ILS or localizer runway 17 is because any ILS approach can become a localizer approach if the glide slope is not working. The difference between ILS and localizer approaches, the ILS has a localizer and a glide slope, while the localizer approach only uses the localizer. The row beneath that, we have the different radio frequencies that we could be communicating with air traffic control on, along with the ATIS frequency for the airport. So as such with VATSIM, you are not always guaranteed ATC coverage whenever you're flying around, so always make sure you are on the appropriate frequency for whatever your flight calls for, because there is a good chance that some or all of the air traffic controllers are not going to be online to help you. The row beneath that is some information about the approach that we are going to load into our plane. So we have our localizer, which is 110.9. That's the frequency we're going to set into the aircraft's navigation radio. And our final approach course is 167 degrees. We're going to set that into the airplane's course selector. That way we can properly track the localizer. Our final approach fix is at Keens, and we need to cross it at 4,012 feet above sea level or 1,848 feet above the ground. The big, bold white numbers are your height above sea level. The number in parentheses is your height above the ground. Our ILS decision altitude is 2,364 feet. Our decision height is 200 feet. So remember, decision altitude is height above sea level. Decision height is your height above ground level. Our airport elevation is 2,164 feet. And our touchdown zone elevation is 2,164 feet. TDZE is touchdown zone elevation. They are not always going to be the same as the airport elevation. Just in this case, it happens to be. The circle on the right-hand side are the different minimum sector altitudes in reference to a specific point. In this case, it's going to be the locator outer marker. That's what LOM stands for. So basically, if we are to the southeast of the outer marker, our minimum sector altitude is 5,600 feet. If we're located anywhere else in relation to the outer marker, our minimum sector altitude is 7,800 feet. So if we're going to descend below those altitudes, we need to be very cognizant of the terrain around us. Next, we have our missed approach. So that's going to be the route we're expected to fly in the event we get to our decision altitude and we don't see the runway environment, or if for any reason we don't think we're going to be able to safely land the airplane. Our missed approach is a climb to 5,400 feet, direct to the Broad River NDB and hold, continue the climb and hold to 5,400 feet. What that means is that if we get to the Broad River NDB and we are not yet at 5,400 feet, we can continue our climb in the hold to 5,400 feet. We don't need to race the airplane up to 5,400 feet the minute we decide to execute the missed approach. Beneath that, we have our altimeter is going to be set to inches of mercury. Our transition flight level is 180, and our transition altitude is 18,000 feet. Pretty standard for the United States. Next, we have the equipment requirements for the airplane in order to shoot this approach properly. So we need an ADF and a DME receiver. The ADF is how we track the NDB. It's the automated direction finder. DME is distance measuring equipment. Next, we have a top-down view of what this approach looks like. So you're going to see the straight-in approach coming in towards the runway, and that little triangular flag icon that's coming off of the runway itself is a visual representation of the localizer. We can see there are 4 different transitions to get us onto this approach. The first one is going to be at the SOT VOR, which is on the upper left-hand side. Not really sure what VOR that is, but that could be one of our transitions. Another transition is on the upper right-hand side, which is from the Weeks fix. Another transition from the Sugarloaf VOR on the lower right-hand side. And then we have another transition from the Broad River NDB at the very bottom of this chart. Now, depending on which transition we're flying, determines how we're going to enter this approach. If we're flying from the SOT VOR, we are going to fly to Juneau, which is our intermediate fix, and then proceed straight in with the approach as normal. Now, the arrow from the SOT VOR to Juneau has some information there for us. At the top of the arrow, 21.0 is our distance in nautical miles from the SOT VOR to the Juneau fix. Beneath that arrow is our minimum altitude of 6,600 feet, so we don't want to go below 6,600 feet. No PT means no procedure turn. We're going to talk about that here in a couple of seconds. From the Weeks fix, we fly directly from Weeks to Keens, proceed with the approach as normal. If we are transitioning either from the Sugarloaf VOR or the Broad River NDB, we will be expected to fly the procedure turn. The procedure turn is that loop that we can see just to the south of the Juneau fix. So how we would fly this is we would first fly directly to Keens. From Keens, we'd fly outbound for 10 nautical miles. Then we're going to start a right-hand turn on a course of 32 degrees and fly outbound for 60 seconds. Then we turn back inbound to a course of 212 degrees, intercept the localizer, and then proceed straight in as normal. The only times you are not going to be expected to fly a procedure turn is if the transition specifically tells you not to fly it, or if you're being provided radar vectors from air traffic control. If you're ever unsure whether or not you should fly a procedure turn, just ask the controller. And on the lower left-hand side, we can see the missed approach fix and the holding pattern that we will be expected to fly. Beneath that, we get to the side profile view of what this approach looks like. So at all these different fixes, we have the different altitudes that we are going to be required to fly. So if we're flying the procedure turn, once we cross Keens outbound, we descend down to 5,600 feet. We execute that procedure turn. Then once we're established inbound, we can descend down to 5,000 feet to cross Wugag. Then from Wugag, we can descend down to 4,100 feet to intercept the glide slope and then begin our final descent down towards the runway. Just keep in mind, you need to cross Keens at 4,012 feet, which if you're following the glide slope, you will easily be able to do. Now, at the very end of the glide slope, you're going to see D1.5 IIMO and an M underneath that. So that is going to be your missed approach point in the event you are flying the localizer approach. So if you're flying the localizer approach, you will descend down to your minimum descent altitude, and you can stay at that altitude until you get 1.5 miles away from the localizer. And if you don't see the runway or the runway environment, at that point, you're going to need to execute the missed approach. The numbers at the very bottom where you can see between Wugag and Keens, there's 3.0. Then from Keens to D 3.0 from the localizer, there's 4.0. That's how far those points are away from each other. So Wugag is 3 nautical miles from Keens, and then Keens is 4 nautical miles away from DME 3 from the localizer. let's draw our attention to this grid right here. So these are different parameters set for the different ground speeds that we're going to be flying. So the very top row is the ground speed that you're flying. The descent angle, which is based on a 3-degree glide path, is going to have the different vertical descent rates that you are going to need to maintain to stay on that 3-degree glide path. Say we were flying at 120 knots ground speed. In order to maintain a 3-degree glide path down, we will want a descent rate of 637 feet per minute. Down below is the time it's going to take us to get from Keens to our missed approach point if we're flying this as a localizer approach. So if our ground speed is 120 knots, we cross Keens, we start our timer, and 2 minutes and 48 seconds is how long it's going to take us to get from Keens to the missed approach point. So if we descend down to our minimum descent altitude, and let's say 2 minutes and 30 seconds has elapsed, we can stay at our minimum descent altitude until we get to 2 minutes and 48 seconds. At that point, if we can't land, we would then execute the missed approach. Over here towards the right, we have the approach lighting system that we can be expected to see. So it's a Mauser approach lighting system with a PAPI on the right-hand side. And they give you a graphic of what that approach lighting system looks like so you know what to expect when you come out of the clouds. We then have an abbreviated missed approach. So it's a climb to 5,400 feet, direct to the Broad River VOR, and hold is published. Down at the very bottom, we have the different minimums for whichever type of approach we're flying. So our ILS decision altitude is 2,364 feet. Our localizer minimums are 2,720 feet. So the reason that the localizer minimums are higher is because we're not getting that vertical guidance. And because we're not getting that precision vertical guidance, they don't want us to descend down lower because it could be unsafe. So if it's a localizer approach, we will descend down to 2,720 feet. We'll stay there until the certain amount of time has elapsed that's required based on our ground speed. And if we don't see the runway, we will then execute the published missed approach. Beneath that, we have the visibility requirements. So on the very left-hand side, we can see the aircraft categories A, B, C, and D. And then to the right are the visibility requirements based on that type of aircraft. So for a full ILS approach, it's going to be a half-mile visibility. For an ILS approach, if the runway alignment indicator light is out or if the approach lighting system is not working, the visibility gets bumped up to 3/4 of a mile. For a localizer approach for categories A and B planes, it'll be a half-mile visibility. For C and D planes, it's 1.25 miles. And if the runway alignment indicator light is out or the approach lighting system is out, it then becomes 1 mile for category A and B and 1 5/8 for category C and D. The last type of minimums that we have are the circling to land minimums. Circling to land minimums are not something that you do very often. The reason you would use a circle to land instead of flying the ILS approach is if you wanted to land on a runway that was favoring the winds that doesn't have an instrument approach associated with it, you can descend down to the appropriate minimums here, and if you can see the airport, you can circle to land on a different runway other than runway 17. So here are the different minimums that are required. And in order to proceed with a circle to land approach, all you need to be able to see at that altitude and with that visibility is the airport itself. The caveat to that is if you're doing your circle to land and you lose sight of the airport in the clouds, you will then be required to fly the published missed approach. So how I do it, if I'm ever planning to do a circle to land, if I get to the circle to land minimums and I don't see the airport, I just commit to the approach that I'm already flying. The next approach I have here is the RNAV approach for runway 2 in Santa Fe. As you can see, it looks very, very similar to the approach in Asheville, but there are a couple of key differences because this is an RNAV approach. The first one we're going to see up at the top is where we had the localizer frequency. We now have a WAS channel. Some of these approaches, it may just say RNAV in there, or it could say WAS or GPS with a channel to program. The GPS is going to do that all on its own. That requires no input from us. So once we load the approach either into our GPS or our FMS, that's going to get tuned automatically. The final approach course, not really required to put that into the aircraft because, again, the GPS is going to do that for us. But if I'm flying a plane like a 737 or a CRJ that has a course selector on it I can use, I'll set that to whatever the course is supposed to be just to keep myself oriented. The other differences with RNAV approaches are going to be the types of minimums that you're going to see. So on this one, we see LPV, LNAV, VNAV, and LNAV only. So LPV is localizer performance with vertical guidance. This would be an example of an approach with vertical guidance. So it's not a precision approach, but it will give us a little bit more accuracy for vertical guidance. And in order to use the LPV minimums, your plane has to be LPV equipped. So our LPV decision altitude is 6,503 feet with 3/4 of a mile visibility. Our LNAV VNAV minimums are 6,553 feet with 7/8 of a mile visibility. And then if we're LNAV only with no VNAV capabilities at all, our minimums get bumped up to 6,740 feet. If we're a category A or B plane, it's a mile visibility. If it's a category C or D plane, it will be 1.25 miles. Next approach we have here is the VOR Zulu for runway 10 in Nassau, Bahamas. So looking at the navigation frequency over here, we would be tuned to the VOR on 112.7, and we would be tracking the 109-degree radial to get us to the runway. Now, if we look at the graphic, you can see the 109-degree radial is not a perfect straight-in approach for runway 10. So when we break out of the clouds, we're going to notice that we are misaligned with the runway, so we will need to make another turn to get us lined up with the runway and come in and land. Here we have a charted visual flight procedure. This is the River Visual runway 19 at Ronald Reagan National Airport. So we could see normally where we would have the radio frequencies in the course selectors, there's nothing there because there's no specific nav aids that we're going to be using to help us fly this approach. It's all going to be based on landmarks on the ground. We need at least a 3,500-foot ceiling with 3 miles of visibility. If we come down to the top-down view itself, you're going to see where this approach starts back here at Fergie, which is 10 DME from the Washington VOR, and we then start tracking basically along the Potomac River and referencing different landmarks to help us determine what altitudes we should be at. When we're 10 DME from the Washington VOR, we want to be at 3,000 feet and then start a turn towards the east of the American Legion Memorial Bridge. Then we start tracking along the river. When we get to 6 DME, we want to be somewhere around 1,800 feet and then continue past the Chain Bridge, continue our descent down to 1,500 feet when we're 4 DME, still tracking along the river. When we get to the Key Bridge, we want to be at 900 feet, continue past the Roosevelt Memorial Bridge and the Arlington Memorial Bridge. And then once we get past the George Mason Memorial Bridge and I don't know how to say the name of that bridge. Once we get past those 2 bridges, we are then going to make our turn to final to come in and land on runway 19. One of the most fun visual approaches you will ever fly is this one right here. And what makes it fun is how challenging it is. And then if we scroll all the way down to where we would have our minimums, there are no descent minimums because it's a visual approach. Now, there is a little bit of a guide here. It says aircraft may visually follow the river to the airport or may proceed via the RNAV runway 19 approach to SeaTalk waypoint, then follow the river to the airport. So if you're going to fly the visual runway 19 in a DCA, highly recommend you throw in the RNAV 19 just as a backup in case you get a little disoriented. Maybe you're not really sure exactly what bridge you're flying over. The RNAV approach will keep you on track. And that wraps up today's VATSIM 101 video. I know there was a lot of information that we covered, so if you do have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments section below. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in to today's video. Really appreciate you all coming out today. And until next time, everybody, this is Cross Hyperu, signing out.